Oh, yeah.
Cool. There's a black box in the bottom of the screen. I'm sorry.
That's
That's our signature. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to make a start. So QSCP would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. In this area, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And we'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that this has been a place on which there has been learning and sharing of ideas for many thousands of years before Plato and Aristotle came along. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first interstate presenter for QSCP. And this is Leonard de Cruz. He's from Melbourne University. He recently completed his PhD on Foucault and normative political philosophy. And it is my great pleasure to introduce him and his talk, Foucault, Political Realism and Normative Political Philosophy. Thank you, Dr. de Cruz.
okay. So first, I'd just like to say how happy I am to be here. It's a real honor to be invited to speak. I've gotten to know Chris, Joel, and Vanessa pretty well over the last couple of years at the ACP, and we've just had some wonderful time. So it's really exciting to be here in Queensland. Okay. So, in this talk, I will argue that Foucault's genealogical method can be used as the basis for a new and distinctive approach to normative political philosophy. I refer to my proposed framework as the genealogically situated approach. This is something I developed under a slightly different name in my PhD thesis, and is now the main concern of my current book project. This framework conceives of normativity as immanent to power, and thus treats our normative concepts as pragmatic tools that we use to negotiate real contexts of action. In this way, it suggests that normative political philosophy needs to become more sensitive to the way our standards and processes of justification have been shaped by relations of power. Furthermore, it emphasizes the capacity of the genealogical method to generate descriptive insights that can then be used to reconstruct normative concepts in ways that will better serve our situated interests. On this basis, I suggest that my broadly Foucauldian approach offers an improvement on one of its main theoretical rivals in political realism. By contrasting the genealogically situated approach with the radical realism of Raymond Geuss and Hans Schlüger, I hope to highlight that the method contains an untapped normative potential. While these thinkers do recognize the importance of genealogy for political philosophy, they underestimate the role of general principles in framing situated judgments. With this in mind, I suggest that the concrete insights provided by genealogy are crucial in historicizing and reconstructing these general principles and normative concepts. Finally, at the end, I will consider Foucault's analysis of social contract theory as a starting point for how the genealogically situated approach can work in practice. Now, I've settled on the term genealogically situated, which is a bit of a mouthful, because while my approach is grounded in Foucauldian genealogy, it also draws on the more reconstructive elements of Foucault's work that exceed this core method of historical description. Indeed, I want to emphasize how genealogy can be leveraged within this broader approach to normative political philosophy. In this way, the promise of genealogy resides in the insights that it can provide into specific contexts of action through descriptively rigorous and empirically grounded inquiry. However, this will also involve attending to politico-ethical considerations that exceed the work of historical description. So in some sense in this talk, I want to suggest how we can take Foucault and push Foucault beyond Foucault. Okay. Let's start by talking about what political realism actually is. Over the last 15 or 20 years, scholars have become increasingly concerned with the supposed methodological turn in political theory. The renewal of political realism, ushered in by figures like Bernard Williams and Raymond Geuss, has led the discipline to reflect deeply on its most basic assumptions. The defining feature of this realist revival is its opposition to what Williams calls political moralism. Namely, the idea that normative political philosophy should proceed from pre-political moral principles. Some realists also argue that mainstream political philosophy lacks critical reflexivity and needs to be more accountable to real politics. And over the last 50 years, analytic political philosophy has been dominated by the methodological paradigm established by John Rawls. While several competing approaches have certainly flourished during this period, Anglophone political philosophy continues to define itself in response to Rawls's work. Indeed, the idea of a realist revival would be unintelligible except as a reaction to the predominance of Rawlsianism. As a response to the Rawlsian paradigm, the realist revival aims to make normative political philosophy more accountable to real politics, although its practitioners often disagree over what would qualify as a truly realistic approach. Broadly speaking, contemporary political realism attends to both the hermeneutical complexity involved in interpreting political situations, as well as the problems that emerge in attending to the moral significance of political action. Although contemporary realism affirms the ubiquity of political conflict, it also breaks with earlier forms of realism by rejecting the essentialist accounts of human nature associated with classical realists like Hobbes and Machiavelli. As we've already seen, contemporary realists are united in their rejection of what Williams calls political moralism. However, there is substantive disagreement within the realist literature about what a satisfying alternative would actually look like. The most important division within the current realist literature is between so-called mainstream realists and radical realists. This division is partly defined by internal debates over the nature of political normativity and its relationship to morality. On the one hand, so-called mainstream realists reject the idea of an autonomous political normativity. Instead, they argue that we should make the construction of political values more sensitive to concrete realities, but openly concede that these values remain tethered to foundational moral principles. On the other hand, contemporary radical realists maintain that political normativity can be detached from morality, and that normative political philosophy can and should operate without recourse to moral principles. While both camps draw inspiration from foundational realists like Williams and Geuss, I will argue that these thinkers actually take a third position on the question of political normativity. Indeed, I suggest that Geuss and Williams argue that politics is prior to ethics, and therefore that all forms of normativity are inextricably political to begin with. In this way, there is a natural affinity between this position and Foucault's own broadly Nietzschean approach. Although we are still lacking a sustained treatment of Foucault's potential contributions to realism, this is not to say that his work has been completely neglected by realists. Indeed, Geuss, one of the central figures of the realist revival, has invoked Foucault's use of the genealogical method in his work, and Prins has rightly drawn attention to the Foucauldian elements of Geuss's transformation and interpretation of critical theory. Although Geuss extols the virtues of Foucault's genealogical method in tracking the relationship between normativity and power, he does not recognize the positive role it should play within the context of normative political philosophy. More recently, Schluger has developed a broadly Foucauldian approach to evaluative theorizing that he has christened diagnostic political philosophy. Schluger identifies a turn in political philosophy that emerged with Marx and Nietzsche before reaching its mature form in the work of Schmitt, Arendt, and Foucault. According to Schluger, this approach can be understood as a philosophy of political judgment that is concerned, quote, with assessments and verdicts, not with general norms and principles, unquote, and should be described as diagnostic insofar as it, quote, attends to concrete situations, seeks to see through them, and reach specific and focused inferences for action from the resulting insights, unquote. Although Schluger rejects the term realism due to its association with essentializing theories of human nature, he does explicitly align himself with the specific kind of contextualist realism offered by Williams and Geuss. Therefore, his work should be understood as a species of realism in an extended sense, and specifically the third kind of realism mentioned on the slide, the foundational radical realism. According to Schluger, diagnostic philosophy offers a radically historicist approach to politics that recognizes the endless complexity of our hermeneutical situation and insists on keeping evaluative standards accountable to real contexts of action. While Schluger certainly doesn't trivialize the importance of epistemological and methodological issues in political philosophy, he recognizes that the promise of the diagnostic tradition is to ensure theory is both held accountable to real politics and comes to bear on political action. Now, despite the wealth of insight provided by his framework, it primarily sets out desiderata for the reconstruction of political philosophy, rather than a detailed account of a new methodology. In this respect, Schluger's work is truly visionary, but it does not explain precisely how we can move from the principally descriptive method of genealogy towards the kind of evaluative judgments that characterize normative political philosophy. More recently, other realists have followed Geuss and Schluger by embracing the genealogical method as an important tool for political philosophy. As realism continues to contend with the problem of delivering a distinctively political approach to evaluative judgment, radical realists have become increasingly interested in the historicity of political thought, and especially the promise of an immanent normativity. This has led prominent contemporary radical realists like Rossi, Prinz, and Reichstadt to pay greater attention to the genealogical method as an essential realist tool. However, aside from the occasional nod in Foucault's direction, their work tends to focus on the use of genealogy in the work of figures like Williams, Geuss, and Skinner. This is undoubtedly important work, but contemporary political philosophy would benefit from a much greater engagement with Foucault's conception of genealogy, given that it represents the most ambitious attempt to develop genealogy into a systematic methodology. Naturally, this leads us to the question of what is distinctive about Foucault's conception of genealogy. As I've argued at length elsewhere, Foucault's genealogical method is defined by a core of descriptive rigor that derives from the fact it is modeled on empirical inquiry. In this way, I suggest that Foucault adopts an empirically accountable, fallibilist, reflexive, and self-correcting approach to historical description. The descriptive rigor of Foucauldian genealogy is an important element that sets it apart from other approaches, such as those offered by Nietzsche, Williams, and Calo, which do not adhere to the same level of historical detail and instead appeal to semi-fictionalized accounts of history to support their claims. On this basis, I suggest that the promise of Foucault's work for normative political philosophy resides in the insights that genealogy can provide into specific contexts of action through rigorous historical inquiry. Rather than evaluating concepts in the traditional manner of normative political philosophy, that is to say, in terms of whether a specific conception of any given concept can be justified on the basis of universal principles or existing intuitions, the genealogically situated approach will try to map the political consequences of this concept according to the different ways it has been used throughout history. Therefore, I suggest that we can revise our normative standards of evaluation by attending to the descriptive insights provided by genealogy. In this way, I place myself in a broader interpretive tradition that emphasizes the problematizing function of the genealogical method. This describes the way Foucault traces the depth conditions for power, knowledge, and subjectivity that structure problematic situations. By tracing these contours, Foucauldian genealogy can provide critical insights that can serve the work of normative reconstruction. That is, the work of ameliorating problems by transforming the conditions that enable them. However, the descriptive core of Foucauldian genealogy cannot do this work of reconstruction on its own, at least insofar as the values that guide the process of reconstruction are in some way prior to the work of genealogical description. This has led Koopman to argue that while Foucault's own work is not normatively ambitious, his method is deeply compatible with the comparably historicist, but explicitly normative framework of pragmatist reconstruction. And a lot of Koopman's work is about bringing these two traditions together, of genealogy and American pragmatism. However, it is an open question as to whether Foucault's work already contains the necessary conceptual resources to implement the genealogical method within a broader normative framework. And whereas Koopman emphasizes the ways in which Foucault's work can be combined with elements of this neighboring tradition, my approach will try to develop the normative resources that are already implicit in Foucault's work, and will especially focus on the immanence of normativity to power. And I would add to that that I'm really trying to bring out, I think, the implicit pragmatism in Foucault's work. Okay. For a long time, Foucault's work has been seen as having a normative deficit. This concern was most famously voiced by critics like Habermas and Fraser, who argued that Foucault's work was predicated on normative commitments that he refused to acknowledge or justify. And this was particularly directed at his kind of early genealogical period in the early to mid-70s. This led Habermas to declare that Foucault's work was, quote, crypto-normative, while Fraser described it as a combination of empirical insights and normative confusions. However, in more recent times, critics have become attuned to the normative vision that emerges in Foucault's later work. Indeed, the final phase of Foucault's work explicitly embraces an ethical sensibility predicated on the values of freedom, self-transformation, and critical reflection. In his famous 1984 essay, What is Enlightenment?, Foucault made it clear that he saw his project as an immanent transformation of the Enlightenment tradition, claiming that his approach was motivated by the canonical Enlightenment values of freedom and critical reflection. Following critics like Joanna Oxler and Amy Allen, I argue that Foucault conceives of these values as part of the historical a priori that conditions his own work. For Foucault, this concept of the historical a priori refers to the depth conditions for knowledge and experience that are historical rather than universal. Of course, Foucault originally developed this concept in the context of analyzing the human sciences, especially in books like The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge. But his later work makes it clear that his vision of historicist critique is applicable to both epistemic and broadly ethical concerns. On this line of interpretation, the politico-ethical significance of our normative concepts can be derived from the fundamental values, again, such as freedom, equality, and critical reflection, associated with the historical a priori of the Enlightenment. These historical values determine the normative choices available to us within our historical present. As Foucault rightly claims in this essay, the reconstructive element of his work emerges through the interaction of these values with his descriptive diagnoses of historical situations. Indeed, he suggests that his historical studies help us to, quote, grasp the points where change is possible and desirable, and to determine the precise form this change should take, end quote. At the same time, he is clearly aware of the fact that these evaluations depend on a more fundamental set of values. Indeed, these values are needed to help determine what desirable change would look like within a specific situation. So it's going to have to be genealogy plus some kind of normative vision. And a normative vision that is obviously historical, in motion in some sense. In this way, we can think of these values as the historical conditions of possibility that make distinctively political concepts like justice and legitimacy intelligible. In my view, then, the values that define our historical a priori set certain political ethical constraints on the work of normative reconstruction. Of course, this is not to say that these values themselves are above criticism. Indeed, our understanding of these values must be constantly questioned and revised from within. And this process of internal critique will also involve drawing on some of our existing values and standards of evaluation to call others into question. This idea will be really crucial in determining the interaction of general principles and situated judgments, which I argue is the main innovation of my genealogically situated approach when compared to contextualist varieties of radical realism, although I'm clearly taking some cues from the pragmatist tradition here, particularly John Dewey. But again, I think this is something that when you dig into it, you also find in Foucault. Okay. This helps to frame the substantive contribution of this talk, clarifying the reconstructive potential of genealogy for normative political philosophy. In particular, I want to show how Foucauldian genealogy can help advance recent methodological debates within political realism. While radical realists have certainly emphasized the importance of the genealogical method for political philosophy, I argue that their approaches are still lacking sufficient clarity around how genealogy can enrich this work of normative reconstruction. But before we get to that, It's first important to acknowledge the significant achievements of radical realism in enriching our understanding of political normativity. Indeed, the most promising element of radical realism lies in its explicit politicization of normativity and moral philosophy. These thinkers rightly recognize that normativity should be treated as something immanent to power and thus thoroughly political. This is what serves to distinguish the radical realism of Geuss and Schlüger from other types of realism. As we've already seen, realism is broadly defined by its rejection of political moralism, which is roughly this idea that political philosophy must appeal to pre-political moral principles in making evaluative judgment. So it's a kind of moral foundationalism that is being rejected here. However, defenders of moralism have rightly questioned whether there could be a domain of political normativity that is autonomous from morality. This response has created a wedge in the current realist literature, as we've seen. On the one hand, we have so-called mainstream realists who reject the idea of an autonomous political normativity, and instead argue that we should make the construction of political values more sensitive to concrete realities, but think that in some way our values remain tethered to foundational moral principles, even if we think these values are political rather than conventionally moral. Although this move successfully evades the moralists' concern about the absence of any kind of moral perspective in political philosophy, it has also meant that mainstream realism has so far struggled to distinguish itself from Rawlsian constructivism at a methodological level. After all, mainstream realists accept that our political values are ultimately built on moral foundations. And there's a lot more historicism in Rawls than might appear at first glance. On the other hand, some so-called radical realists, such as Rossi, Prinz, and Aitash, maintain that political normativity can be detached from morality, and that normative political philosophy can and should operate without recourse to moral principles. For example, Rossi explicitly argues for an approach that grounds normativity in epistemic considerations rather than moral ones. However, the problem with this view is that it really doesn't explain how this rejection of moral foundationalism is compatible with the idea that our political judgments retain genuine normative force. And I think when you look at some of this work, you see a kind of implicit normative perspective that is politico-ethical rather than purely epistemic, particularly around the theme of equality. So with this in mind, I argue that realists of both stripes, contemporary radical realists and mainstream realists, tend to underplay the most interesting and distinctive claim that has emerged from within their own tradition. This idea is found in the work of the two most important figures in the realist revival, Williams and Geuss. This is the claim that our moral principles must be understood as inextricably political to begin with, and therefore that we must treat politics as prior to all forms of morality. Indeed, both figures share a genealogical perspective on morality and politics that treats moral and political normativity as intimately bound up with the everyday workings of power. This allows us to clarify the truly distinctive contribution of realism, that our values must be understood as immanent to the field of politics itself, and therefore the political philosophy must resist the impulse to seek a strict separation between morality and politics. Indeed, I think this is actually what distinguishes realism from its main methodological competitor in ideal theory, which it rightly chastises for its lack of critical reflexivity and its tendency to abstract away from real contexts of action. Overall, the strain of realism represented by Geuss and Schlüger offers a radically contextualist theory of judgment that emphasizes the ways in which specific beliefs, judgments, and principles are always shaped by the political and historical conditions under which they are devised. For Geuss, normative concepts are always formed under the pressure of power, meaning that even our most fundamental moral intuitions have a complex relationship with matters of ideology. For this reason, Geuss takes a starting point to be an extension of Lenin's question, which is famously, who does what to whom for whose benefit? In other words, Geuss thinks that politics should begin by studying power within these specific contexts and with an eye towards making practical interventions. Rather than starting with a kind of normative master concept like justice, as you find with Rawls, or legitimacy, as you find in a lot of mainstream realism, Geuss argues that political philosophy should begin with a realistic assessment of how power functions within society. so our starting point should be diagnostic, rather than explicitly normative in the first instance. Following both Nietzsche and Foucault, Geuss suggests that ethical concepts are actually the outcome of historical struggles, going as far to say that, and I love this quote, ethics is usually dead politics, the hand of a victor in some past conflict reaching out to try and extend its grip to the present and the future, end quote. Naturally, this leads Geuss to emphasize the value of the genealogical method for normative political philosophy. Indeed, he thinks that normative political philosophy must begin with an investigation into the historicity of our principles, and then trace both their historical transformation and real effects of power within concrete contexts of action. Okay, so far, so good. But the problem with Geuss's approach is that he openly declines to provide a systematic theory of political judgment or any clear method for evaluating our normative concepts and standards. Although he is right to emphasize that our judgments should be radically contextualist and historically reflexive, he ultimately fails to explain how we can move from a diagnosis of our current situation to an evaluative judgment with clear consequences for action. A point that is only complicated by the fact that there is often radical disagreement or even conflicting evidence over the nature of the situation in question. In some sense, it is open to interpretation, both descriptively and morally. Indeed, even his more recent work on the importance of imagination in politics seems to concede that contextualism cannot really be practiced in systematic terms. Geuss is certainly right to deny any formulaic theory of judgment, but his brand of radical contextualism does not explain what imbues context-specific judgments with their normative force, and I think this is the main deficiency in an otherwise very promising view. Okay. So, in terms of preserving the normative force of critique, Geuss's most promising response actually emerges in his reading of Bernard Williams's work. Williams is primarily concerned with specifying the conditions of legitimate political authority, at least in his later work. His approach begins by identifying the first political question as, quote, the securing of order, protection, safety, trust, and the conditions of cooperation, end quote. On this view, a state is legitimate only if it meets what he calls the basic legitimation demand. That is to say, that it offers an acceptable solution to this first political question, this question of order. For Williams, an acceptable solution to this first political question will have to meet at least two requirements. The first is what he calls the critical theory principle, which holds that, quote, the acceptance of a justification does not count if the acceptance itself is produced by the coercive power that is supposedly being justified, unquote. The second requirement is that the solution makes sense to those who will be subject to the arrangement. And he uses this term, makes sense, as a kind of technical term. This means that his account of legitimation is both hermeneutical and contextualist, insofar as it requires us to make sense of the arrangement being offered to us by appealing to a value of concepts that are historically contingent. This historicist dimension of his work is what leads him to offer the formula that legitimacy plus modernity equals liberalism, which may strike you as maybe a little too easy. In other words, he thinks it is theoretically possible for there to be legitimate states that are not liberal, but also claims the conditions of modernity have made liberalism the only system that really makes sense to us, and thus the only acceptable solution to the first political problem, and I quote, now and around here. Again, maybe a little too easy. According to Williams, this approach represents a significant break with moralism, insofar as it understands legitimacy as a practical question rather than an ideal arrangement. And this is precisely what is supposed to make his theory more realistic than the standard Rawlsian approach. Now, Geuss is ultimately unimpressed by Williams's endorsement of liberalism, but he is impressed by Williams's refusal to appeal to any conception of a morality that is prior to politics. Indeed, Geuss's suggestion is that Williams needs to be understood as a radical historicist, and that this has clearly flown under the radar in contemporary realist scholarship. And he argues that Williams thinks that normative concepts derive their justificatory force from the role they play in real-world practices. So Geuss goes against the grain of mainstream interpretations of Williams by suggesting that he embraces the Nietzschean reversal of ethics and politics, specifically by adopting Nietzsche's genealogical view about the creation of values. In fact, Geuss argues that Williams wants to replace ethics with politics by affirming the primacy of politics to human life. On this line of interpretation, Williams does not understand legitimacy as an abstract problem that demands a philosophical answer, but rather as a practical problem that we confront in concrete terms. In this way, an acceptable solution to the first political question is something that we must continuously negotiate in the day-to-day trenches of political contestation. This also means that we can read Williams's critical theory principle more as a provocation to think about the complex nature of oppression and freedom, rather than a requirement that can be decisively satisfied once and for all. Okay. So Geuss's political interpretation of Williams's work has significant implications for our understanding of normativity. Rather than conceding that the basic legitimation demand is justified by an implicit appeal to context-transcendent principles, it suggests that Williams sees the normative force of our concepts as deriving from their function within real political situations. Far from treating morality as the final arbiter of politics, Geuss offers an immanent conception of normativity that acknowledges the role that power plays in the constitution of both moral and political values. This is both a strategic and a pragmatic conception of normativity, insofar as this account recognizes that normative concepts are always formed under the pressure of historical power relations, but also used as instruments to negotiate real contexts of action. So they're strategic insofar as they're shaped by power, they're pragmatic insofar as they're still useful as tools. This brand of realism also treats genealogy as its paradigmatic method insofar as its approach is radically historicist, radically contextualist, and begins by tracing out the power relations that structure the situation in question. So, big tick so far. All of this is right as far as it goes. However, radical realism is clearly not without its flaws. Indeed, I argue that Geuss underplays the importance of general principles in framing political problems and producing situated insights. And he gives rules a very, very hard time. Now, there are good reasons to give rules a hard time, but I think he's at least right to insist that general principles are useful, even if they cannot be interpreted in a purely abstract way. They need to be more accountable to real political situations. Yes, I agree. But they are useful, they are important, and this is something that I think Geuss and Schluger basically miss. Indeed, this raises an important question about what kind of role these contextualist approaches leave for normative theorizing. While Geuss argues that politics is primarily about power, he also accepts that normative considerations must eventually be addressed by political philosophy. The political interventions are morally significant, and that normative concepts like justice play an important role in making evaluative judgments. However, one might reasonably expect that we need an explicitly normative framework to clarify or reconstruct heavily contested concepts like justice. While Geuss rightly argues that a minimally realistic approach to political philosophy will, quote, encourage one to understand the ways in which power, interests, priorities, values, and forms of legitimation concretely interact in society, end quote, he does not systematically address the question of how these forms of legitimation might retain their normative import while also being immanent to power. Furthermore, he does not provide any guidance about how general principles are supposed to interact with specific judgments. Now, he rejects general principles and sometimes suggests he is opposed to the use of general principles in political philosophy. But I think it quickly becomes clear that what he is really opposed to is any principle that claims to be universally valid and historically invariant. Furthermore, Geuss does acknowledge that political judgments are always produced within broader frameworks of beliefs. So it remains unclear, nonetheless, how precisely Geuss is going to account for the normative function of principles in framing our understanding of specific situations and how they interact with situated judgments. There's just a kind of gap there. Similarly, Schluger suggests that his diagnostic approach can reach focused and specific inferences for action based on descriptive insights, but does not account for how our pre-existing normative assumptions are likely to shape those inferences. Indeed, he claims that we need a philosophy of political judgment oriented around assessments and verdicts rather than general norms and principles, but underplays the extent to which political judgments are made with recourse to more general concepts. After all, we typically make political interventions based on a range of more general assumptions. For example, what we've learned from our own previous experience, historical insights that we have inherited from others within a particular tradition, various forms of empirical evidence that might be relevant, and what we perceive to be the moral significance of certain actions. This means that we always approach concrete political problems based on a broader orientation to politics in general. This orientation is defined by a number of background assumptions about the reliability of our empirical methods and the nature of causality in the social world, as well as an antecedent normative sensibility shaped by underlying moral sentiments. Indeed, it is hard to see how we could make any kind of judgment without recourse to more general principles of various kinds, and particularly normative concepts more generally. Although radical realists are certainly right to suggest these principles are immanent to real politics, this does not detract from the fact that general principles are indispensable for making judgments, nor does it explain why we ought to prefer one set of principles or assumptions over another. Indeed, Schluger explicitly acknowledges that his approach, quote, may appear nihilistic in that it refuses to spell out general principles of action, end quote. So the difficult question for the contextualist approach associated with radical realism concerns which evaluative standards should guide this process of revision. After all, radical realism is still missing a theory of how contextualist judgments acquire their normative force. This problem derives, I think, fundamentally from its rejection of moral foundations and its bold claims about the inescapability of power relations. Which is not to say that we should return to that, but clearly, if you're going to reject moral foundationalism, you're going to have to come up with something better and something more satisfying, I think. Or you can just embrace nihilism. But we're hoping to get a little further past that. Let's see how we go. While Geuss and Schluger are right to emphasize that this process should be guided by pragmatic concerns, they do not offer a systematic account of how it should proceed. The challenge, then, is to explain how we can move from a description of a political situation to a normative judgment without appealing to universal moral principles. For this reason, I suggest that Foucault's conception of the historical a priori is crucial for mediating the dispute between mainstream realists and contemporary radical realists. Furthermore, I suggest that this appeal to the historical a priori as the source of our values constitutes an improvement on the already promising approach offered by Geuss and Schluger. This is because Foucault's concept provides us with a view of general principles as historical constructs rather than universal ideals. And while the values that are sedimented within our historical a priori must be scrutinized and revised on the basis of insights into real political situations, they still play an important role in framing political problems and producing judgments. This process will resemble Foucault's internal critique of Enlightenment values like freedom and critical reflection in important ways. Indeed, Foucault's historicization of these values does not operate at an abstract level, but rather draws on specific genealogical insights to ensure they are calibrated with the historical problems they are designed to solve. So this historicization of realism is done in the kind of rich empirical work of genealogy rather than abstract philosophical argumentation, at least in the most fundamental way. There is an abstract dimension to this, but the real kind of, the proof is in the pudding of genealogy or genealogical insights. In this way, we can understand general principles both as practical heuristics that we can use to solve political problems and as historical conditions that set politico-ethical constraints on this process of practical problem solving. Importantly, The process of revising these principles will emphasize the interdependence of principles and judgments. This helps to establish the concrete value of the genealogical method for normative political philosophy. On my view, Foucault's use of the genealogical method serves as an exemplary model for how we can track the practical consequences of our normative concepts within real situations. In this way, it helps to deliver on the otherwise abstract promise of an instrumental account of normativity by detailing how we can revise our normative concepts based on pragmatic considerations. This work is especially important in giving concrete meaning to otherwise abstract political principles, such as the basic legitimation demand or the critical theory principle that you find in Williams's work. Okay. Now, I'm aware that most of what I've said so far is quite abstract, and so it still might not be that clear as to how my genealogically situated approach is supposed to work in practice. So I'd like to finish tonight by offering an example that will hopefully help you to grasp the reconstructive potential of genealogy, namely Foucault's analysis of social contract theory. In my view, Foucault's use of the genealogical method serves as an exemplary model for how we can track these practical consequences of our normative concepts. In this way, it helps to deliver on this otherwise kind of abstract approach. And I would particularly like to emphasize that the detailed historical work you find with genealogy is really crucial here. This is absolutely central. The proof really is in the pudding. The reason I will focus on the social contract is that it is a normative concept that has become crucial to dealing with the problem of legitimate political authority under the conditions of modernity. In other words, it has become an indispensable tool in negotiating the limits of state power and the rights of citizens within our historical a priori. Indeed, even if we reject any context-transcendent justification for contractarian notions like legitimacy, consent, obligations, and rights, these concepts remain so deeply embedded in our historical a priori that we have no choice other than to start from within this framework and consider how well different conceptions of the social contract have served our society before embracing, modifying, or dispensing with them. They at least deserve our kind of close attention and scrutiny. Although Foucault rarely dealt with state-centric political discourse in his published work, he did pursue a genealogy of Western political thought in his now famous political trilogy of lectures at the Collège de France. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the first two lectures of Society Must Be Defended, which contain his most sustained engagement with the idea of the social contract. According to Foucault, the traditional problem of modern political philosophy was to determine the proper limits of power in accordance with a specific theory of legitimacy. By contrast, Foucault presents an approach that fundamentally reverses this relationship between legitimacy and power. Rather than assuming that the correct theory of legitimacy could demonstrate both the origin and the abstractly justifiable limits of state power, he instead asks how this discourse of legitimacy has been shaped by power relations and in turn induces its own effects of power. In other words, he seeks to treat legitimacy as something immanent to power rather than something that transcends it. During his critique of the juridical model of power, Foucault argues that the modern discourse of legitimacy is predicated on the idea of the collective will, as embodied by Hobbes's figure of the Leviathan. In this way, Foucault explicitly rejects the tendency to think of the state as, quote, a multiplicity of individuals and wills that can be shaped into a single will or even a single body that is supposedly animated by a soul known as sovereignty, end quote. In Foucault's view, this juridical model creates at least two ideological distortions. First, it obscures the multiplicity of power relations distributed within the social body. And second, it rationalizes the status quo by claiming that the state, at least in principle, could be the codification of a collective will. In contrast, Foucault makes it clear that his relational model of power does not assume the primacy of an autonomous individual in the constitution of state authority, but instead understands the myth of the individual as an effective power itself and within the framework of state sovereignty. And I quote, "It is therefore, I think, a mistake to think of the individual as a sort of elementary nucleus, a primitive atom or some multiple inert matter to which power is applied, or which is struck by a power that subordinates or destroys individuals. The individual is not, in other words, power's opposite number. The individual is what a power's first effects." End quote. While Foucault's rejection of the juridical model is well documented, this more specific anti-individualist critique of legitimacy and sovereignty remains an underdeveloped theme in his work. However, the recent publication of the 4th volume of The History of Sexuality, titled The Confessions of the Flesh, provides some insight into how Foucault may have developed this idea if he had have lived to write a more complete genealogy of Western political thought. Towards the end of that text, Foucault argues that the modern legal subject is made possible by Augustine's much, much earlier discussion of consent in the context of marital relations. Indeed, this subject of sexual relations gradually morphs into the autonomous legal actor that Hobbes would claim as the fundamental element of the social body. On this basis, Foucault claims that the notion of consent, quote, makes it possible to designate the subject of concupiscence, that is sexual desire, as a subject of law, end quote. So he's historically problematizing this notion of consent. Okay. In this way, Foucault reinforces his broader genealogy of liberalism by casting doubt on the ontological individualism that serves as its foundation, and thus undermines the fiction of the, quote, consenting individual underpinning the framework of social contract theory. This notion of consent suggests that there could be an agreement made between suitably rational, autonomous, and relatively equal persons under certain conditions. But the problem with this view, at least from a Foucauldian perspective, is that people do not stand in relations of equality with each other, but rather in relations characterized by complex and shifting inequalities, created by discrepancies in physical capability, intelligence, and various kinds of capital. Furthermore, Foucault's insights into the diffuse and pervasive nature of power cast doubt on the very notion of consent. Indeed, he suggests that power relations are always immanent to social relations, and that power relations are the consequence of the divisions, inequalities, and disequilibriums that occur in other kinds of relations. Rather than assuming that there are necessary and sufficient conditions that would allow us to achieve a state of autonomy in which we could freely give consent, Foucault complicates the dichotomy between freedom and oppression by suggesting that freedom is always conditioned by power, insofar as power relations structure the field of possible action within a given period. For Foucault, then, freedom is better understood as a reflective capacity that is not possessed, but rather exercised in response to specific and sometimes subtle forms of coercion. In this way, we might question whether the notion of consent is sustainable insofar as it implies the idea of a voluntary choice that is completely free from the influence of power. And this is kind of the real upshot there. So that's the descriptive work. We then move to a more normative question. So for this reason, it would be tempting to dismiss the contractarian framework as irrevocably contaminated by the negative effects of ontological individualism in distorting the operation of power relations below the level of formal political equality, so between individuals. Nonetheless, an interesting question remains as to whether Foucault thinks consent is a useful fiction. And this is precisely the point at which we can move from historical diagnosis to explicitly normative considerations. This normative orientation to the social contract is not something we find in Foucault's published work, but it does emerge in some of his interviews, albeit in an underdeveloped form. In a 1983 interview at Berkeley, Foucault is explicitly asked about the consensus model of politics championed by Arendt and Habermas, and whether it would retain some value as a fictional procedure despite its theoretical limitations and questionable political effects. While Foucault explicitly rejects the suggestion that consensus could serve as a regulative principle for political philosophy, i.e. the thing that political philosophy must do, he does suggest that the notion of consent might play a role in supporting the work of resistance to oppressive power relations. Although Foucault thinks the sovereign model is inadequate for understanding power in society, he appears to accept that the subject of law is an entrenched mode of subjectivity that will not easily be swept away, and, historically speaking, that it has served as an important means of limiting state power. Indeed, he argues that a general approach to resistance could begin by questioning, quote, what proportion of non-consensuality is implied in such a power relation, and whether that degree of non-consensuality is necessary or not. And then one may question every power relation to that extent. The farthest I would go is to say that perhaps one must not be for consensuality, but one must be against non-consensuality, end quote. So we again here encounter Foucault's positive valuation of freedom. And the obvious question here is how we can identify a non-consensual relation without some positive notion of consent. It is easy enough to see why Foucault would be reluctant to develop a regulatory principle around the notion of consent. After all, he makes it abundantly clear that there are dangers in trying to subsume our understanding of power within a theory of legitimacy. Something that, as we have seen, is borne out by his critique of the juridical model. Indeed, by offering a positive definition of consent, there is a danger that certain possibilities for freedom and resistance will be obscured by assuming that the individual is fully autonomous and thus able to offer their unconditioned consent. However, the terminology Foucault negotiates within the context of this interview is informative. While he rejects the suggestion that consensus could be regulatory, he is willing to accept that it could serve as a critical principle. The difference resides in the function that the concept is being asked to perform. Indeed, while Foucault makes it clear that a regulatory principle tries to delimit the way that a phenomenon has to be organized, a critical principle serves a pragmatic function in critiquing and potentially altering concrete power relations. In this way, he clearly thinks that a concept like consent might serve as a useful fiction insofar as it serves to combat power relations that have become oppressive or otherwise pernicious. Foucault's late engagement with human rights also suggests that he saw some scope for strategic mobilization of normative concepts derived from social contract theory. Indeed, he again suggests that it is possible to deploy these concepts without endorsing the kind of externalist justifications that previously served as their historical origin and theoretical foundation. In a 1981 interview with Jean-Francois and John de Witt, Foucault claimed that his interest in human rights was motivated by strategic considerations rather than by his well-documented repudiation of anti-humanism. But rather than any repudiation of his well-documented anti-humanism. Very different meaning there. Quote, I try to consider human rights in their historical reality while not admitting that there is a human nature. Human rights were acquired in the process of a struggle, a political struggle that posed a certain number of limits on governments and that attempted to define general principles that no government should break. It is very important to have clearly defined frontiers against governments, no matter which governments, that incite indignation, revolt, and permit struggle when they are crossed. So, as a historical fact and as a political instrument, human rights appear to me to be something important, end quote. Of course, this means that Foucault's endorsement of human rights is provisional, and his conception of the idea is directly tied to the strategic situation of minority causes in post-war culture. In this way, Foucault recognized the practical efficacy of human rights discourse in helping to establish limits on state power, and especially in securing legal protections for marginalized and oppressed groups. Conversely, it should be clear that Foucault is not endorsing rights as inherently valuable, and certainly repudiates the metaphysical foundations that have traditionally been trotted out in their defense. For this reason, Ben Golder correctly argues that a Foucauldian approach must recognize that there is an ambivalent dimension to rights insofar as they are simultaneously emancipatory and regulatory. So they change the space of freedom, and there are new possibilities there, but there are also potential restrictions. Indeed, human rights discourse has been frequently criticized for imposing the individualistic values associated with liberal capitalism on non-Western communities. In fact, they are sometimes seen as a strategic instrument used to promote Western imperialism at the expense of the welfare of dispossessed peoples and developing nations. But regardless of the specific effects of rights discourse in different political situations, it should be clear that human rights continue to play a central role in structuring political struggles over a diverse range of issues concerning privacy, sexuality, gender, health, immigration, and economic inequality. From a Foucauldian perspective, it is important to recognize that human rights cannot simply be dismissed as an incoherent fiction, but must instead be analyzed and reconstructed in ways that better serve the interests of freedom and justice. By drawing on genealogical insights into the specific effects of power generated by different conceptions of the social contract and its core normative concepts, we will be able to reconstruct these ideas in ways that will help us to realize more desirable outcomes. Of course, this process is complicated by the fact that the standards we use to judge the desirability of these outcomes are partly constituted by the very same concepts. Once again, the solution to this problem is to emphasize the interdependence of general principles and situated judgments, which are always accountable to each other. Indeed, this accountability to real political situations makes it possible to discriminate between the normative options available within our historical a priori, our specific field of freedom and choice. The task, then, is to continuously revise our conception of these historical values on the basis of situated insights. Ultimately, my argument is that Foucault's genealogy of social contract theory and his broader approach to human rights discourse serves as an exemplary account of how the genealogical method can support the situated account of normativity. Indeed, this approach should lead us to first analyze a framework like the social contract strategically, that is to say, by conducting a descriptive analysis of the actual effects of this notion over time and in its different manifestations. And the next step is to consider the work that it does pragmatically, that is to say, by evaluating whether the consequences of this concept are desirable, before considering how this concept might be reconstructed to better serve our situated interests. In this way, the genealogical method is crucial not only in delivering a situated diagnosis of the function these concepts play in our shared political lives, but also makes it possible to consider how they might be reconstructed to deliver better outcomes in the face of both present and emerging problems. Of course, genealogy does not actually make these pragmatic judgments by itself, but instead offers descriptive insights that can then be evaluated within a broader normative framework. Indeed, this is what I take my original contribution to be, insofar as the genealogically situated approach offers a framework that is broadly compatible with Foucauldian genealogy, but that pushes it in an explicitly normative direction. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. De Cruz. So we have about half an hour for questions, everybody. So would anyone like, yes, please feel free to take a seat in the question chair. That's our you might have screen now. Does anyone would like to decide on questions? Okay, yes, you go.
No worries, if you've got, right.
I've got a question, but you go first.
All right, thank you. That was really enjoyable. I'm really glad I managed to come tonight to see that, so thanks very much. My question is really about if this